Morning, Melanie.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to this very special briefing for members of Parliament, which is part of a series of virtual briefings with the support of the Wilderness Foundation and ICCF. A special welcome, of course, to the honourable members, and a big thank you to the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, the Honourable Fikile Xasa, for hosting this briefing. Welcome also to everybody who's joining us via our live YouTube channel. As we all know, the COVID pandemic continues to pose enormous challenges, not only in terms of global health, but also our economic future. Around the world, legislators and decision makers are grappling with the question on how to stimulate economies that will not only bring about growth, but also more equality amongst people, and importantly, also environmental sustainability. There seems to be a growing global consensus that this point in history provides an opportunity for exciting new ideas that can be better for people, the environment, and thus also for our collective future. And this is what we're going to discuss today. We have 3 experts in this field who will each give a short input, just 10 minutes, after which we will give MPs the opportunity to ask questions. I want to remind MPs that you can do so. Just indicate to me through the chat facility or alternatively WhatsApp me. So our first speaker today is Ismail Momoniat, who is Head of Tax and Financial Sector Policy at National Treasury. I think most MPs know Momo. I had the real privilege to work with him in the post-94 Parliament, where we spent very many late nights working on the Municipal Financing Bill. I'm thrilled that he's here and could spend some time with us, together with many of his team in Treasury. So, Momo, over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, thanks, Melanie. And hi to all the honorable members and everybody else. And thanks for this opportunity to present. I think climate change is the most important challenge we face, or that humankind faces. So it's always good to talk about the green issues, particularly as we're drowning, but with our heads up over COVID. So let me start without much further ado. So I think what I'm going to do, if you can move to the next slide, I'm not going to go through all the slides, but I've got our team here. I know that will join us. I've put some of their names up, not all. And I won't deal with old issues like, what is the science saying? There's a number of papers, the UN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in particular, and supported by other reports like from the WEF and so on. But I think I just want to touch on the big question. I think the big question is, for us in the world, how does the world deal with global problems, which by definition are not limited to individual countries? And I think we saw this recently, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, with the 2008 global financial crisis and how the world responded. Because there was a recognition, something that started out in the USA spread like a pandemic. We didn't know what a pandemic was at that point, but to many parts of the world. And you couldn't get a kind of each country response. You had to coordinate between countries, even as each country had its own policy. And I think we've seen this now more recently, or in the current crisis with COVID. It doesn't help to say one country must come up with a way to deal with it. You've got to deal with this internationally, which in a sense, unlike the global financial crisis, where there was a lot of unity in the way we dealt with it, it's quite different now, especially as you've seen policies, particularly in the US and some countries, where there's quite a strong element of denialism amongst people who are in power. And so perhaps these two crises prove on, they provide good examples on what to do and perhaps what not to do. So getting to climate change, and I think the important point is uh, we don't delay, I think, on taking steps on climate change because of this pandemic. Indeed, The Economist a few weeks ago ran a whole headline, sort of the front page was "Seize the Moment," and they were talking about flattening the climate change curve. Next slide, please. I won't go into these issues, but I think to make the obvious points, if we delay on actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to be much tougher, if not almost impossible, to do something about it. We've committed, though it's not the actual target in the Paris Agreement, but the softer target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which hopefully will become much harder as we go along, but that's what we should be focused on. Move on. And this comes from the UN conference. I don't have to introduce you to Greta Thunberg, but I think it's very important to look at her message that, climate change is not just about us. It's not just about spreading a pandemic from one country to another and to affect the current population. It's about affecting the current population and impacting on future generations. So if you care about your children, you care about your grandchildren, we better start doing something. Move on. Now, I'm not going to deal with the next two slides, except just to show that throughout the world, if you look at the World Bank 2020 States and Trends in Carbon Pricing, you'll see that there's a number of initiatives in countries, both via emissions tradings or carbon taxes, that have recognized that steps need to be taken. And these include both advanced economies, where you've had most of the prior emissions, and emerging countries, developing countries, who are also beginning to act, and certainly currently some of their emissions, of course, are higher than even the advanced economies, even if in the past they didn't emit as much. Move on. You can move on as well. Given the short time, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm not going to also deal with this, save just to say that South Africa has been a very strongly committed to the UN process, and in particular to the Paris Agreement. And we've, provided our nationally determined contributions about how much we've committed to bring down emissions. And we've put in place a carbon tax, which has now taken effect in the current year. And in fact, we are going to be awaiting, there's been a slight postponement, but the first set of payments from this tax before the end of this year. Move on. Move on. I won't deal with this. It's just to show you how the tax is structured. And now this is the topic that I want to deal with. I think that in addition to all the other measures we've taken, I think that internationally it's been recognized that we've got to get better disclosures by companies, by countries on their emissions. And what we find is that many countries have some countries or some stock exchanges have pushed to develop their own frameworks, and you have about 400 frameworks in place. But there's been some of them are voluntary, like in South Africa. There's mandatory ones in other countries. And then there was the task force on climate disclosures, which was led by Michael Bloomberg, which also started looking at an approach to get more disclosures. Move on. Next slide. And I think just another parallel angle to take into account, that even as we looked at the global financial crisis, the Financial Stability Board sort of emerged from the crisis and in a new form. And the IMF sort of has this publication which comes out twice a year, the Global Financial Stability Report. And these reports have focused on the impact on companies. And what does this mean for investors? And certainly investors have begun to take into account that your aggregate equity valuations do not really reflect fully the impact of climate change. In fact, it wasn't reflecting it at all in many instances, but more and more is beginning to take that into account. And the recognition that we need better disclosures and to perhaps develop a more mandatory disclosure format and a more harmonized format. So this is something that we've taken on in our instance, even though there's been a voluntary system that's been run for listed companies by the JSE. Move on. But like all these initiatives, they tend to be limited and don't go far enough, and those that don't really feel like complying tend to not really provide all the information that's required. So in particular, aside from moving with companies, both financial and non-financial, there's also a recognition that the financial sector itself needs to go much further. And we need to look at these, the financial sector. And again, the Financial Stability Board also began to start a process to looking at these disclosures. If you look at the previous slide, we quote Mark Carney, who was a former governor of this Bank of England, who led this initiative. And so what Treasury did was, following on in 2017, we started a process to develop a paper on financing a sustainable economy. It's just to ensure that all stakeholders, not just investors, trade unions, regulators, NGOs, actually have access to real information from companies and particular sectors within the financial sector, which you can divide into banking, insurance, retirement funds, asset managers, capital markets. And there's a link to the paper that we released a few months ago. Next slide. And this tries to cover the area of sustainable finance and situate it. It's, may not be a totally comprehensive paper. It's the first step at trying to contextualize the whole area of sustainable finance. Just move on. And, you find that even in the sort of, labels that we use, that these terms are not really, there's no accepted international terminology. And so we've attempted to try and define these in South Africa. And so that, and as I said, it's not comprehensive. And so it doesn't deal with, for example, broader ESG issues, but it does attempt to harmonize definitions and disclosure standards. And we put this out for comment. It's just closed, and we're looking forward then just to updating this technical paper and taking it further with a sort of action plan that was also being proposed. Move on. It's just a process of all the many stakeholders within industry mainly that were consulted. We can move on. Sarah, do you want to come in, I think, on the next slide and just talk through this quickly, since you did most of the hard work on this?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So just some of the challenges and recommendations that the paper highlights in the banking sector is that we predominantly rely on voluntary initiatives, and the implementation is not currently supervised by our regulators, both the Prudential Authority at the Reserve Bank as well as the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. So the recommendations are for further analysis on feasible regulatory instruments for climate risks in the banking sector, and similarly for the retirement and insurance sector as well. So, for example, in the insurance sector, a survey that was done showed that while 79% believe that climate change will affect their business, only 37% report on the impacts. The key recommendations from the paper and the initial focus areas which will be taken forward using a working group approach is to firstly develop a green taxonomy, which is the fancy word for a classification system to identify assets and projects that deliver on key green objectives, and having identified thresholds and targets, and as well as a governance framework so that taxonomy can be expanded over time. Internationally, you have things like a brown taxonomy or a sustainable development goals taxonomy, so that can be developed over time. The second recommendation is to promote sustainable financing instruments, the most common of which is green and social bonds. And this working group and recommendation will look at mapping what instruments there are and how applicable they are in South Africa, and the appetite there is of investors, and what enabling environment is required for them to grow. The third recommendation is to establish a baseline and minimum disclosures for climate risks as per the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures. So in most of our working groups, we're building on international guidance, but making sure it's relevant to South Africa's of investors and what enabling as well as our just transition to a low carbon economy. The fourth one is to develop a climate risk scenario, which will be used by the regulators for stress tests in the sector, starting first with insurance and banks, and then to build sector capacity. So once a taxonomy, different instruments, disclosure requirements are provided, then capacity both in terms of the financial sector, local government specifically, and more broadly will be able to use these tools and implement them. And then to develop an action plan to take forward all these focus areas. So we see it really just as a manageable starting point to mobilize the financial sector to move towards more responsible practices that will ensure a stable, resilient, and competitive economy. It builds on a sustainable finance narrative that already exists in South Africa and networks of cooperation and coordination. So the JSE is a big proponent in this area. They have a green bond segment that is being launched as and broadened as a sustainability segment. Investec, for example, this last week or two have released a TCFD disclosure. So we're really building on the work that's being done and providing a kind of government enabling framework and path for the sector to follow. The working groups that were established from 2017 have been expanded to include other relevant organizations as well, and they're busy finalizing terms of reference for these different areas and how we sequence the work going forward so we can focus both our energies and our skills. There will be broader consultations. We had a webinar last week through the National Business Initiative, the NBI, that kind of kickstarted the green taxonomy work as an example. And the process is really intended to be open and engaging. It's really a new process. The EU, for example, they released their green taxonomy, I think, in December, and they're still doing regulations. Mongolia has recently released a taxonomy. We've had a call with the National Bank of Georgia, who are also doing a taxonomy at this time. So we're all learning in this process, and that's why we've opened the paper for comments. And I know the deadline has closed, but there is still a few comments trickling in, and that is fine. And we appreciate the feedback, both positive and critical, because from our perspective, these opinions need to be voiced in order for us to understand them. We come from a very specific perspective from National Treasury, so we need to understand different opinions and uses of this work in order for it to be incorporated.
Okay, let me deal with the last slide, Sarah. Chair, just to end, I think that, we just wanted to paint the context that clearly the whole issue of climate change is a broader initiative, firstly. And in South Africa, we've started with the carbon tax and our commitments to the Paris Agreement. We need to also look at then the role. Obviously, your companies are your major emitters, and whilst the carbon tax has started with the scope 1 emitters, we need to look at all companies that are listed as the next step and get these disclosures right. And then in particular, we've looked at the financial sector and what specific role it could play, what specific role could the regulators play. I want to emphasize at this stage, we're not doing it to force, or even when doing stress testing, it's not really linked to the kind of enforcement like Basel rules. We've at this stage, we feel it needs to be more, moral pressure through disclosures, but we don't rule out that going to the future, that tougher actions need to be taken. And I think I want to end by just saying that, the bigger issue for us is how do we move towards a kind of green economy deal for South Africa. There's huge potential that can be unlocked. That's what some of us believe. There's issues around the circular economy and reducing waste. I mean, one just looks at the problem of plastics, that we think that there's new markets that will be open, that if we act in a climate smart way, that we'd become much more resilient. And we believe that it would also expand employment opportunities. And whilst we're not dealing with this in these slides, I think that we want to situate these initiatives within a broader area. And to end off, as I said, I think we must guard against the COVID emergency not delaying us on taking action on the green front. That's a clock that's ticking, and time is not on our side. Thank you, Chair. I'll stop there, and sorry if we have gone over 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Momo. And also just to say, we will send on the presentations to the members of Parliament. I've already done so, in fact, by WhatsApp. Our second speaker today is also somebody who doesn't need introduction. It's Lungisa Fuzile, who for many years was, of course, the Director General of National Treasury before he moved to the private sector. He is now the Chief Executive Officer of Standard Bank, which I think might have looked like an easier job at the time, although I'm not so sure at the moment anymore, Lungisa. Thank you so much for also agreeing to speak here today, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And I acknowledge honorable members of Parliament and everyone on this call. And thanks to the Wilderness Foundation for putting this together. Let me just start with the importance of how the topic that I was asked to speak on brings together two very important issues that the world is confronting today, not just South Africa. And what are those? It is the fact that because we have been hit by the pandemic, as everyone on the call would know, the South African economy, if you just take us and leave the world, will contract in the second quarter by about 30%, and for the full year by anything between 7 and 8%. So with all manner of consequences for employment, average incomes, poverty, you name all sorts of social and economic indicators. That's the one problem that the world confronts. But that problem found us grappling with yet another problem, which is the climate crisis, which Momo has covered very nicely. And part of what we have, perhaps if I could pass judgment on many of us, and without apportioning it to a particular sector of society, is that we have tended to talk past each other on this second problem of the climate crisis. We tended to present it as though the choices that the world faces, that South Africa included faces, it's between being a greenie, you want to reduce carbon emissions, and that's all for you, or you care about growth and development and everything that's positive that's delivered by that. I actually think that putting this as sharp as that and as contradictory as that does not serve us anymore. I would contend. I think that South Africa is very lucky. Everyone has heard Momo articulate, representing government, representing one of the key regulators of the financial sector, for an example. He has articulated that we care about the damage caused on the environment by the investments that are made aimed at growing the economy, creating jobs, and making sure that there is inclusivity. We care about it. And I think, I'm not suggesting that South Africa comprises of a monolithic population. Everyone believes in the same thing. But I say, on average, the discourse here is not about whether there is a climate crisis or not. The issue for us, and I want to put this as the first big point for me, is striking the balance. Striking the balance as we now are faced with the crisis that I talked about as I started, of an economy that is going to contract massively. How do we make sure that the recovery balances the need to grow the economy very fast in ways that create more business opportunities, in ways that ensure that there is inclusivity, there are more opportunities for large numbers, millions of South Africans to participate in the economy. Balance that with making sure that we don't only get it right today and then tomorrow wake up to realize that our actions of today that have delivered growth and delivered jobs have created a crisis of tomorrow, as in harming the environment. And in this regard, I like how the Harvard Kennedy School of Government suggests we should strike the deal, perhaps this deal that Momo was referring to. It suggests that, for instance, there should be, emerging out of this crisis, a partnership between all sectors of society and governments in acting responsibly and ensuring that the recovery is also green. And we cannot succeed in doing that if we ignore the fact that certain sectors have been impacted disproportionately more by the current slump. And in this regard, they go on to make the second suggestion, which is to say that we must also have then transition plans for sectors of the economy that are impacted the most. Your fossil fuel sector, tourism and hospitality, and transportation. Now, I am sure that this does not mean that try to revive the fossil fuel sector. No, not at all. But if you are going to talk to policymakers, and I spent the best time of my life working with them, if they are facing a problem of a contracting economy, a problem of rising unemployment, poverty, and so on, if you appear to be oblivious to that plight when you are advancing the cause for greening the economy, then you run the risk of not being listened to. And I like, therefore, the suggestion that they make that we need to spend more time, energy, thinking a lot about this just concept of a just transition and focusing it disproportionately more on impacted sectors. And lastly, they suggest that we need organizational capabilities in a whole range of areas to ensure that there is this mindset shift to longer term goal, linking the present and the longer term, to be just short, ensuring that what we do today and the social objectives that we seek to accomplish in the longer term can connect properly. I do want to move then to the next point, which is about, for me, the fact that in SA we're lucky because the regulators we have are progressive. We have had Momo, for an example. They have published a very beautiful document that sets out the vision for moving towards a more sort of low carbon intensive economy, which is commendable. And what I like about it, which I think sometimes we don't use enough as South Africans, to reinforce that which we want or that which we're aspiring for. It sets out beautifully the example of our EIPPs, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, which is a very superb program that shows just how many of these things that even the Harvard Kennedy School of Government theorizes about have been given expression to in South Africa in practice, and they've delivered. It's an amazing thing, actually, that we don't talk enough about. What am I referring to here? We know that South Africa tried for over a decade to move towards renewable energy, but didn't get it right until a whole range of things got set out. And once the stars were aligned, everything just moved like that. What do I mean by that? The renewable IPPs required an adjustment to the regulatory environment, the laws, the regulations, and you can even put inside that the whole concept of redefining the incentives, the context in which all players would participate, government providing guarantees, government using its development finance institution in the DBSA to underwrite the risk that the private sector perceived as being too high and therefore pricing it excessively. I'm not suggesting that they are too cheap after that, by the way, but at least the interventions worked. They ensured that we could have a renewable IPP program. Boom, once we got everything right, investments in excess of 200 billion rand took place, of which about a quarter, if I'm not mistaken, just under a quarter, were foreign investors. So what is the takeaway from this? If you get the regulatory environment right, if you get the incentives right, if you get enforcement right, partnering between government and the business sector, it is possible to achieve a hell of a lot in this area. If you go and check statistics, not only did the IPPs solve the energy problem, which was quite dire at the time, by adding over 6,000 megawatts to the grid at a time when we needed it a lot, but we also then solved the climate problem, or contributed positively towards solving the climate problem. We also contributed towards solving the jobs problem. First, the jobs that were created when the projects were being built, but last and not least, but also solving the energy problem, and therefore downstream utilization of energy in industry. So it is for me exceedingly important then to draw on those lessons and apply them in the period ahead. As a financial institution, this is where perhaps the second last point I'll make, and very briefly because I know I'm out of time. We have done several things as Standard Bank on our own, not because anyone set rules for us to do these things, to make sure that we are a responsible financial services business that helps support investments that are contributing towards reducing carbon emissions. We invested massively in supporting businesses or lending to businesses that invested in the RIPPs on the continent. Of the energy projects that we have supported, for instance, beyond South Africa. And we know that energy is in dire need on the continent. 86% of what we have put out towards investing in energy is towards clean energy projects. So I'm saying that a combination of rules, regulations enforced very well, and they must be clear and provide a certain policy environment with moral persuasion, just explaining to business that acting responsibly is in your interest, because what you do not want and what we do not want as banks and broader financial services businesses is that the investments that we make today be it in energy and other projects, cannot yield reasonable returns in future because we didn't pay due attention to the issues of sustainability insofar as climate change is concerned. And we see the problem in front of our eyes when we don't act responsibly. The last point I will leave the meeting with before I shut up is that Momo has touched on the issue of reporting. That too, Momo, and everyone on this call, the fact that it's not happening as well as it should is, in my humble opinion, less to do with people seeking to obfuscate, to obscure, to hide facts, but more to do with complexity of what we're dealing with. And therefore, it is exceedingly important that we should hold each other's hands and work together towards improving the reporting and more transparency in terms of what we do to the environment as we make a range of decisions as financial institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lungisa. I have to warn you, there's a couple of requests that's coming through here on WhatsApps to me saying, can you please ask him to come back to government? So there you go. I want to introduce our last speaker, which is Candace Stephen. Candace describes herself as a green finance innovator and landscape finance expert, which I think basically means she knows an enormous amount about finance and the environment. I just want to remind everybody that after Candace's presentation, we will open the floor to questions from MPs. So a reminder, you can just indicate to me either by WhatsApp or in the chat box if you want to ask a question. Candace, over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and my co-panelists, and good afternoon, Chair and honourable members. It's a pleasure to be discussing this with you this afternoon and to gather in solidarity as we face exceptional challenges during this time as South Africans. Firstly, I'd like to send my condolences to anybody listening whose families may have suffered loss due to COVID-19 and are enduring hardships. I'm deeply saddened by that loss, but continue to be inspired and remain immensely grateful to South Africans from all walks of life doing all they can to contribute to dealing with the impacts of the pandemic in the country. I think it's incredible how we as a people are able to gather together to deal with shared and complex problems. This is one of those instances in our history where we have the opportunity to build back better with a proposed green recovery that could create a more resilient, more inclusive, and more sustainable economy environment for our people. We have to note that our unsustainable and exploitive use of the planet and its species have created this unprecedented global situation. And our consumptive and linear economies have not withstood the pressure, and they've proven their lack of resilience, leaving impacts to be felt by the most vulnerable in the most acute ways. South Africa has already received shocks and impacts from nature-related experiences such as ongoing drought, the city of Cape Town facing day zero not so long ago, things that we can't forget and that are creating additional impacts on top of COVID-19. So to recover from our current crisis, as well as build resilience to dealing with future shocks as we move forward, a paradigm shift is needed. We can no longer treat the environment as something separate from our economy or from our lives. It's central to both. What's more is that leading global economists agree that green recovery packages offer higher returns for investment, superior long-term cost savings, and create more jobs. A green stimulus for South Africa would give us a strategic advantage in helping us to create in excess of 500,000 new green jobs, save close to 2 trillion in risk, and ensure that South Africa remains competitive and relevant internationally, whilst at the same time fostering co-benefits for a sustainable future. I agree with the expert views expressed today about the opportunities that a green recovery would offer us, but at the same time noting that these need to be feasible and they need to be tailor-made to our country context. There are a lot of international precedents, but there are also incredible innovations and experience within the South African context itself. The chance to assist livelihoods in a robust way post-COVID-19 as we recover from the impacts of the pandemic, and to ensure a resilient and inclusive economy going forward, means we can also protect our unique habitats and manage our natural resources in a sustainable way. These things go hand in hand, and it does not need to be an either-or situation. And there are a number of key pillars to achieving this, and some have been touched on already during this discussion. But in summary of what a green stimulus would offer to South Africa, there are 3 focal points. Firstly, the protection, management, and restoration of South Africa's natural systems, which underpin so many different sectors. The South African economy is reliant on its biodiversity and its ecological infrastructure. This speaks to our protected and conserved areas, as well as transforming our land management and agricultural practices to be more regenerative and sustainable. The biodiversity sector alone offers over 418,000 jobs, which is equivalent to the mining sector. These jobs need to be secured during the crisis. Additionally, there needs to be investment to maximize the growth potential of the biodiversity economy, which has its greatest impact with the most marginalized in our society. On top of this, natural resource management creates ongoing work opportunities year on year, particularly in rural areas. Yet, more can be done and should be done to expand and hone the effectiveness of these labor-intensive and ecologically important efforts. Ecosystems globally are estimated to be worth $125 trillion annually, and they underpin key sectors such as farming, fisheries, forestry, conservation, and tourism, and employ 1.2 billion people globally. This is true for South Africa too. And investing in the health of our ecosystems and natural resources will assist us in creating new jobs as we recover from COVID-19, but will build resilience into our economic systems and social systems to prepare us for future shocks from climate change and biodiversity loss. Enhancing our resilience will be built in by strengthening our food systems, diversifying our sustainable supply chains, improving our health, saving species, and drastically reducing the cost of risk from disasters. The second key focal area is around the water sector, which faces critical issues that need to urgently be addressed, yet at the same time offers opportunities for job creation and environmental resilience, and should be a focal area for the green stimulus package. Managing and safeguarding our strategic water source areas and water catchments, upgrading infrastructure for water waste and treatment facilities, and ensuring that there's training and capacity building in water management will allow us to build green infrastructure and jobs that safeguard the country from future water disasters. And of course, there's renewables and the just transition to a low carbon economy, which is an imperative for South Africa to reduce our emissions, meet our international targets, and create a safer and healthier environment for South African citizens. It is also a must as a big game growth changer. It could boost and catalyze new jobs, additional supply chains, and open up new export markets, particularly across the African continent. The sector is hyper-responsive to stimulus money, and global evidence indicates that in addition to 3 times as many jobs are created through clean energy than through oil and gas. Not to mention the fact that a stable energy supply would in turn boost economic activity in the country. But in order to give true effect to these opportunities, there are some public sector recommendations. Firstly, ensuring the alignment of fiscal reform measures with any green package given, such as incentivizing green solutions and the preservation and maintenance of natural resources, and then addressing fossil fuel subsidies, which we have to ask within a contracting fiscus, can we really afford this? And can we afford to forego the loss that we receive there. In addition to that, we also need to address administrative pricing around energy and water in particular to ensure that that pricing is more inclusive. Lastly, regulatory reforms, which were touched on earlier, are absolutely critical. Firstly, to unlock private sector investment for nature-based and climate-based projects, but in addition to unlocking barriers for SMMEs and for green finance innovators. SMMEs and innovators are critical actors for a social environmental transformation. Recommendations for the private sector include building biodiversity and ecosystem considerations legitimately into the finance sector, such as ensuring that landscape innovations are built into the taxonomies that we're currently developing in country, but at the same time, committing to address the barriers in accessing available finance for green innovators and SMMEs. A green and inclusive recovery would have massive co-benefits for the country. Increased economic resilience, improved health and welfare, job creation at the local level, business empowerment, saving species, looking after our biodiversity-rich and dynamic landscapes, as well as reduce pollution. Need I say more? Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you very much for that, Candice. Can I now open the floor for questions? I'm going to start with the Honourable Hannah Winkler, who's asked whether she can ask a question. Hannah, go ahead. Let's just make sure that your mic is unmuted before you ask.
Thank you. Just trying to get some more adequate lighting here. All right. I don't know if you can hear me properly here.
We can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the presentations. I found them. Can you hear me?
We can. Yes, go ahead.
You're just breaking up a bit now. Yes, so thank you to everyone for the presentations. I found them very informative. What I did want to ask was, with regards to the finance sector, how do we incentivize, I think, businesses to adapt climate mitigating and resilient approaches, when perhaps in property development, when finance for building, for housing, etc. So basically, making sure that if you are going to apply, say, for capital or a loan, that there's a portion of the agreement that says, well, you have to ensure that there are going to be solar panels. You're going to be using solar panels so that's more energy efficient. You're going to implement, new environmental technologies to ensure that there's more energy efficiency, for instance. You're going to be using, say, somehow collecting rainwater. So basically trying to incentivize the private sector through financing agreements to adopt more environmentally friendly practices. And well, that obviously comes to government and them sort of regulating the finance sector and forcing them to incentivize the private sector through finance. How does one do that? And then I think it was the CEO of Standard Bank, the gentleman was talking about the just transition and how that usually is sort of like the one impediment to one of the impediments to a swifter transition to renewables. And the whole thing is that, one has to repackage that argument, because at present, the quality of jobs that are in, I would say, the mining sector, these are very poorly paid jobs. They're very dangerous jobs. The health of those mine workers is severely compromised. And if we look at a green economy and a green sector, we could essentially create such better quality jobs and newer jobs. So there's a lot of fear, I think, and stigma around that. Like, how is that going to affect, certain sectors? very impoverished sectors, but it is actually about improving their circumstance and presenting that argument so that you can reassure individuals and communities that they're not going to be losing out. Yeah, so that was the other issue. Yeah, and then, yeah, okay, that's all from me at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I see, Momo, do you want to start? And then the other two speakers can also come in. Or alternatively, Lungisa, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah. Look, I'm not
Oh,
sure.
Momo
Okay,
came in.
let Lungisa start. Let Lungisa start.
Okay,
Okay,
Lungisa.
Momo, no, thanks. I'll try to be brief, not to take all the time. I think that the concept of incentives, Hannah, works very well, and it is in your answer. And it works both ways. You know, regulators can price the things that they don't like expensively, so that people cease to use them or use them a lot, and try to do what is necessary to make the alternatives that you want people to use more of cheaper, not artificially so. They must be cheap but still profitable for those who invest in them. And we have got examples in the system, and Momo might talk on them about them. Government did provide people with solar heater geysers and ensured that it was cheaper for those who took them to take them, and so on and so forth. Similarly, never underestimate penalties. If you then make sure that those who cause damage to the environment pay for it and pay a lot, then they will stop doing it, because you make it unprofitable to do things in ways that damage the environment. The economics of pricing works. On the just transition, it's a complex issue. It does require that it be explained properly, and I don't have easy answers to it. But I do think that good communication of the opportunities, and it must be very concrete. Our fellow panelists made this point very well, the last speaker, that it must be pragmatic, it must be feasible. People must feel they must be able to touch the opportunities that are offered by the green economy. And they must indeed be better, look, feel, and impact people in better ways than the alternatives. And people will buy it. People accept good reason.
Momo?
Yeah, hi. Look, let me say that, there's no easy answers to some of the questions. I mean, those are the real questions we have to deal with, is how can we, not from a tax sense, but broadly incentivize people to do the right things, and certainly not incentivize the wrong things. So, for example, we don't have fossil fuel subsidies in South Africa. In fact, if anything, on some fossils sources, like if you take fuel, we have a relatively high fuel levies and other taxes in the system. One can argue, about whether they're high enough or not. But, even when you take up those issues, I think we've got to make sure that we're actually dealing with the real problems of people. So something which Lungisa put forward, that, when you look at the issue of climate change, you've got to find a balance and a way of doing it, and not assume that there's not going to be pushback. Even relatively normally on social issues, they tend to be more progressive, no matter who's in power. But if you look at Canada and you look at Australia, they had carbon taxes, or in the case of Canada on the Kyoto Protocol, when they had conservative governments, they actually, took a 180-degree turn from what was there. So it's quite important that in whatever we do, we win people around, and that there is a sufficient supply of, if you want cleaner transport, given the spatial divides in South Africa, if you look at transport, how do you get people to come to work without using fossil fuels in the future? I mean, that clearly requires public transport systems. It's going to require investments. It's going to require your planners to come in. So there's big decisions to be made on some issues. But to the extent that on the margin, what we have currently, if there are specific fossil subsidies, please tell us which ones they are, because we may be missing it. It may well be that even those companies may be using general incentives that are there in the system, but there's no specific subsidies to promote particular fossil fuels in our system. But we're open to looking at it. There are also initiatives, and I'm disappointed that it somehow stopped. For example, we had a program to subsidize people putting in solar geysers. That for some reason got stopped at some point. So as Treasury, I think we're open to look at those issues, and I guess all I'm saying is we need to also design them in a way that wins over the hearts and minds of people as you do it, because you can have the subsidy, but people will still go back to the old. So part of the initiatives is to get the polluter pays principle. And if you look at with the carbon tax, yes, we are focused on scope 1 emitters, but we are trying to make them pay for their emissions. So you can also make it more expensive rather than incentivizing. Also make it more expensive for people to continue emitting in their old ways. But we're open on those issues. I think these are all open areas for further discussion and engagement, and Treasury would welcome any specific proposals if anybody has them.
Thank you. Candice, did you also want to come in?
Yes, so I think there is no silver bullet to this solution. I think it requires an integrated approach to be able to see these types of gains across different sectors. So the OECD gives very clear guidance around using incentives for behavioral change, and the most effective of these being positive incentives, which have been applied in some instances to success with green finance in South Africa, creating a positive incentive that then creates a positive behavioral change. That also then needs to be coupled with what's been referenced already around penalties, and something like the carbon tax, which is essentially in place to reduce emissions. But at the same time, that needs to be brought in with administrative pricing, with regulatory frameworks, and those regulatory frameworks either to enable and allow those green innovations and reward those types of green innovations, but at the same time provide guidance to move in a direction where we move beyond impacts that are devastating for the environment and for a resilient economy going forward. But this really requires a diverse skill set and a diverse approach, and pulling that together to be able to unlock all those different components.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to the Honourable Mchunu, and thereafter, just so that they know I haven't forgotten about them, the Honourable Singh, and then the Honourable Olamisa. Honourable Mchunu, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you to all the speakers. Greetings to all the colleagues that are part of this informative presentation. My question, the first one, is on the banking sector and the banking as they're developing the policy, will be that how can we ensure that when we assist those green economy projects, we also focus more on rural and township economy as a banking sector, so that they can try and do away with those limitations that makes those communities not to access easily the funding. So if you can also look at that. And the other one is to the treasury in terms of accommodating those, I'll call them the newcomers in the green economy, those that will be interested in coming up with projects that are going to assist. If they as the policy is being developed, and if they can be accommodated. The last one on the infrastructure, I noted in the presentation that where they talk about boosting climate smart and resilient infrastructure, that as we talk about the infrastructure, we also possibly include the production of or the industrialization of the infrastructure that we will need as we continue with this green implementation of the green economy, and getting more funding, so that when you say here is a youth that wants to start to be the independent power producer, but using the green economy, but the infrastructure that they need cannot get it from South Africa. We have to import that and to get those big machines from those other developed countries. If we can look at that, and how can we focus on also the industrialization of the green economy, but making sure that they as they are industrialized, but they don't produce those gas emissions that we are trying by all means to avoid. Thank you.
So we have quite a number of questions coming up. So I'm just going to ask the speakers to the people answer the questions, just to keep it as brief as possible. Lungisa, do you want to go first, and maybe just keep it focused on the green side of things?
Yeah,
because it's a big question that was asked of you.
Yes, I will prefer than usual. We follow where individuals put up projects as banks. So if government has set a regulatory environment, priorities, and enabled entrepreneurs to invest in the rural economy in ways that enable that investor to pay us back, we will always support them. And we are agnostic about whether it's urban or rural.
Thank you. Momo?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think what the specific question was.
Infrastructure in the townships, and how do they enter? How government will help to enter into the green economies?
Yeah, I mean, I thought, was putting forward that, we clearly need to focus on infrastructure. I mean, in particular, if you look at townships, how do they connect to the rest of the economy? And I think that, there are opportunities, but also we need to invest in infrastructure which kind of, in reducing emissions, I think will also offer safer options. I don't have specific proposals, but certainly I think one needs a very inclusive approach, which was the point I was making earlier, and win people's hearts and minds, and it will be to everybody's benefit if we do. But yeah, I'm not, I think there's many possibilities, but one needs to look at those as they come.
Okay, Candice?
So I think a critical thing here is to look at entrepreneurs and SMMEs, particularly around green innovation, and what can be done to assist them to enter into markets and have access to available finance. So there is a role for the private sector to play there, but at the same time, there are a number of key barriers for SMMEs, which government could strategically look at to be able to bring local actors to the fore in addressing not only job creation and economic development, but at the same time, green innovation.
Thank you. Honorable Singh?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Melanie, and to all presenters and my colleagues. Thank you very much for the presentations that you've made. I think Momo mentioned the COVID emergency, and we must not let we must not actually let go of our ensuring that we reach the goals of a green economy. I think, Momo, that the COVID emergency has actually assisted us, because if anything, there's been lots of environmental gains, less plastics, less pollution, etc., etc. However, when you balance it on the other side, we've lost a lot of lives. But as far as environment is concerned, I think our challenge is to ensure that the gains that we've made do not slip away. And how do we do that? But listening to everybody, excellent points. I think we've got excellent policies in place, but enforcement still is lagging behind tremendously. Now, if we just have to look at plastics, I don't know whether the imposing a levy on plastics, I know it started at 3 cents, it's now 12 cents a bag, has helped us in any way, because the national flower in South Africa is still the plastic bag. So what do we do? And we need political will to ensure that we get industries that are manufacturers and traders stop this practice. And I think the lobby from that side is just a bit too strong on our government at the moment. We must follow the Kenya example. So I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that. Imposing taxes, imposing levies, just in my mind, don't really help us. Let's look at acid mine drainage. I mean, it's going to cost us billions to sort out the issue of acid mine drainage. What are we doing to make all those people that were responsible for this acid mine drainage to pay? And the last point I just want to use is possibly air pollution. I mean, one of the biggest polluters is our own state-owned enterprise, Eskom. And how are we as Treasury and assisting to ensure that there's cleaner energy available to people? I think the example has got to come from the top. And if we didn't have this 10 years that we lost because there was this debates on nuclear and should we have it, shouldn't we have it, who's going to make money for themselves, we could have advanced far. But I still think that we have an opportunity to move forward. Treasury has got to support this. Environment budget as a department has been cut. Now, that's not a good thing. We would think they should get more money to just, to ensure that the gains that we have made now are sustained in the future. So those are just a few of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Momo, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I see these all as contributions. I mean, the thing is that, firstly, I think on COVID, as I said, not only must COVID not be used as an excuse not to proceed on climate change measures, but the COVID pandemic, I think, does sort of point out that if you ignore the science, as countries did, including the US, that once the epidemic was out and you knew about it in January, you wait 2-3 months before you act. Now, irrespective of the source of any virus, once you know it's around, you need to act. And I think that is certainly a big lesson on climate change. It's perhaps more slow burning. It's not as quick as COVID, but that it's there. Its impact is going to be bigger. And I think that to align with the politics is also difficult because, any political system, the focus is on short-term measures. How do you get the world to focus on more longer-term objectives? I think is not as trivial as it sounds. It's actually quite complicated and difficult to get people to take those measures because we're very used to kicking the can down the road, and the road becomes a very long one. And before you know it, there's no road, and we're in trouble. So yeah, I mean, I can just agree with what Honorable Singh is saying. On plastics, in fact, the bizarre issue has been that whilst it may not, we've never said that levies by themselves will solve any problems, that you actually need an entire set of complementary measures with any measure. You need alternatives for people, you need recycling, you need other regulatory measures, you need enforcement. If you think that, that, for example, a tax or levy by itself is going to reduce consumption, that may not necessarily be the case, or it may reduce it too little. So, and certainly with plastics, is one big area that the Treasury has signaled it intends to move on. We're talking to the Environmental Affairs Department, and we're also looking at measures on the recycling economy so that you have these complementary measures in place as we move on these problems. One of the bizarre outcomes of COVID is that it's actually going to probably temporarily increase the use of single-use plastics as we've all been too frightened to touch anything. So hopefully that's just a small blip, but we do need to deal with those issues. But I agree with Honorable Singh that, the levy by itself won't work alone. I think that one needs to look at a series of complementary measures.
Thank you. Honorable Holomisa.
Thank you, Melanie, and colleagues, and our guests. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My question or comment is directed to the Treasury. And I also wish to commend them that at least they have finally introduced this carbon tax. I still remember when Mr. Fuzile was the DG, we had a workshop which was organized by the Champions of Environment Foundation, which I chair with Gibbs. I'm happy that at least it is coming to a fruition. However, the question I would like to pose to the team from National Treasury is, don't you think we may have to ring fence the revenue generated through carbon taxes in order to establish a South African climate change fund, which would be used to fund programs which would mitigate against climate change challenges? I'm thinking here about the very lack of waste management in this country, which some of you have raised. We can create a lot of jobs through this. If you look into South Africa today, in all 9 provinces, you see signs of desertification. One would say the desertification has begun to march towards Pretoria head office. So what are we going to do about that? Whereas if this fund were to be created and to be dedicated to these programs like fighting this desertification, soil erosion, fence off mealie fields and grazing fields in the rural areas, and to make sure that you educate people. Mr. Fuzile, you will agree with me, we are from the same district in Nkandoli, Eastern Cape. When we were growing up, we used to make sure that the animals are taken to the relevant places, not loitering around all over the place. There were fences which were there in those grazing areas. But today, lack of discipline has cost the environment of this country. I think we need to inculcate a culture of ownership, and in doing so, the state must make sure that they ring fence this money which comes out of these carbon taxes. Otherwise, we'll never measure it, because once you put it in one basket, then the president and other provinces are going to say, oh, we need this money for that. And then we ignore the environment completely. Thank you.
Momo, I'll give you a chance, and maybe Lungisa and Candice, I'm sure you might want to come in on that as well. And I mean, I also recall that originally when Vali Musa brought in the whole idea around plastic bags, it was supposed to be ring fenced, but I'm not sure that that's done now at all. Momo, do you want to respond to this?
You know, as a Treasury official, we're hardwired to say no to earmarking. And I'll say that if you want good examples, look at the current taxes we earmark. And those are excellent examples about why you don't want earmarking. I think, Honorable Horomisa, the issue is, and when it comes to climate change, in any case, I think we should probably be spending much more than what we're going to generate from the carbon tax. So it doesn't get away from the need for funds for infrastructure that say shift us towards a greener environment, that that you still need to go back to the budget and to orientate. I would add the entire budget towards greener objectives, not just the little money we might collect from a specific instrument. So and I think, you know, any approach towards the fiscus, I mean, or studies have shown just how inefficient earmark taxes are. Everyone where they sit prefers earmark taxes because it also then undermines the accountability system on how you spend, what it's spent for, and how you make decisions. So I think that all of those issues come in. I think we must focus on what we agree on, the need to actually fund greener projects and to shift the world towards a greener economy. And the question then is, how best do we do it? That's how I would take up these issues. I think if you look at the plastics issue, yes, it wasn't quite earmarked, but it was supposed to fund a recycling initiative, which then actually didn't run properly. Okay, perhaps sometimes in government you learn how not to do it. That we still need to recycle is still there, but we haven't moved sufficiently on those issues.
Candice, do you want to come in on this? Thank you, Momo.
Thanks, Melanie. And Honourable Holomisa, I think your suggestion is a really interesting one, and I do tend to agree with Momo around how the fiscus operates. The simple fact is we simply don't have enough financial resources at our disposal to be able to address our environmental challenges. And so bringing it back to the discussion around a green stimulus for South Africa to recover from COVID, it means that there is a dual benefit with a number of different available options and opportunities for the country. And that finance, obviously, there's an enormous role that the fiscus has to play, whether it's through levies, penalties, incentives, etc. But at the same time, there's a role of the private sector to come in with investment finance and other instruments that are available, and to look at different mechanisms to be able to address the different concerns that you've raised, whether it's desertification, different issues with soil. And we know that across the country, our natural resource management and sustainable land management, those efforts have to be upscaled. And so there are job creation opportunities as well as environmental opportunities at the same time. And to unpack exactly how we use our existing resources, how we bring in additional financial resources so that we can achieve those goals simultaneously. And I think we need to be able to use every option at our disposal at this time, from every levy to every subsidy, every incentive, every investment tool. We need it all laid out and integrated together if we stand a chance of addressing the post-COVID recovery and ensuring that we have a resilient economy and environment moving forward.
Lungisa, did you want to come in on this?
Yes, on a small point, out of respect for my general, which is to say that, I'm sure, General Horomisa, you can take away from Momo the point where the two of you agree, which is that there is a need for, and as Candice was reinforcing this, there is a need for resourcing this new approach to our world. It won't happen on its own. And then there will always be the contest. Are the resources enough? Are they being used efficiently? Whether they come ring-fenced or in other ways shouldn't be the big issue. I'm sure you would agree. I also think that what we should acknowledge, which is what I was touching on, but perhaps brevity sometimes causes one to lose substance. We need new capabilities to be able to drive the thinking towards the new economy, if I may call it that, although we have been at it. But if we want to accelerate and step up our game, then we will need new capabilities. And this is true. Most people might think that I'm talking about capabilities in government now, to not only to write the rules, but also to enforce the rules. But we also need new capabilities inside business too, so that our own thinking is right, but also technically we can do the right things, including, for instance, among other things, something that I didn't touch on during my original presentation, which is the issue of being able to infuse an appreciation of the long-term risk associated with each project that we do. Let me say, by the way, short and long-term risk associated with every decision that we take, every financing of a project that we undertake, so that the whole spectrum where decisions are taken has got an alignment towards making sure that the decision is not only good today, but it's good tomorrow, and it's good in a decade and a century down the line.
Thank you. Honourable Phillips.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentations. They were great. I'm actually very concerned about the populist decisions that are taken. You know, often we say we need to drive it from the bottom up or from the top down. But what we're finding at the moment is that bills like the emo bill that made its appearance in 2011, it then gets shelved. Now that's got amazing opportunities for independent people to actually come into the market and make a contribution towards green energy, but it's been put away. And we have a whole colloquial on canned lion hunting, and a decision is taken and then it's changed. We have reclassification of wild animals for farming. We have this amazing solar geyser project for low-income people, but those geysers are sitting in warehouses racking up storage fees. You know, it actually boggles the mind that the opportunities are there, and in some cases even the materials are there, but they are not being used. And I think we need to, especially as parliamentarians, we have to keep putting pressure on government to take the right decisions, not necessarily the popular decisions. And the enforcement of how can I say, of crimes against the environment must also be a priority for our government and for our people, because people are allowed no rehabilitation of mining sites. You contact the DMR and, oh, well, we'll think about it. Or otherwise you don't get a response. So I think as parliamentarians, we really need to take this very, very seriously, the green economy. And we need to put pressure on government, not just to take populist decisions, but there must be decisions that are taken in the interests of not only our environment, but in the interest of our economy as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. This will be the last question just because we're running out of time. So I'm going to give each of the speakers an opportunity. I know some of those questions most probably relate more to the Department of Environmental Affairs, but I'll give you each a chance to say something if you'd like on this specific question, and then maybe if there's still one minute the wrap up that you want to do, and thereafter I'm going to pass over to the chair of the Environmental Committee to just make some final comments from the committee side. Candice, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Melanie. So I think there were a number of very specific issues in that previous question, but just to address the issue around enforcement, it is something that is lacking across the country. And it is a potential opportunity to bulk up enforcement, create training, capacity building, job creation that can then roll out the regulatory frameworks that would then support a green economy and support the underlying assets that create the opportunities for that economic activity.
Thank you. Momo?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. That's rare, Momo. Thank you. Lungisa?
I will follow the example of my boss, Momo. We are fine. I mean, I just look. It warms one's heart to just see the alignment among South Africans from one of the broadest ranges of spectrums. I mean, we've got MPs here. We've got people from the private. We've got people from government. Although in my case, I'm somewhere between government and the private sector, but I'm in the private sector now. The key with these things is then not to fight the wrong battle. I always emphasize to people, we are agreeing that climate change is happening. The crisis is there. We need to strike the right balances. Can we now knuckle down to do the hard work? Try these things out, do them on the ground. And when we fail, go back to the drawing board, fix and try again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And on that very positive note, I want to hand over to the chair of the Portfolio Committee on Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, the Honourable Fikile Xhosa, after which I'll just close the meeting. Comrade Chair. Chairperson, are you there?
He's on AWOL. Must charge him.
I think, yeah, it looks like we have lost the chairperson.
General, this is not the military.
Yeah, chairperson, we will, I mean, unfortunately, it seems that we have lost the chairperson. So with that, then, we come to the end of our briefing today. I want to thank the speakers, members of Parliament, and everybody who joined us on YouTube. We hope to follow up with another briefing in the week of the 10th of August, possibly on how we can continue to finance protected areas in this country, given the economic crisis that has been created by the COVID pandemic. We look forward to seeing all of you again then. And in the meantime, stay safe and goodbye, and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.